From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew, back in the nation's capital the day after. Following former President Donald Trump's victory over Nikki Haley in the New Hampshire primary, we'll get reaction ahead from Libby Cantrill of Pimco and Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report. Plus, negotiations continue on a possible border deal in the Senate, but any potential compromise may not stand a chance in the House. We'll discuss that with our political panel. And Kevin McCarthy speaking out, sharing his thoughts on the state of the Republican Party, the nomination, and the fate of Speaker Mike Johnson in a special interview with Bloomberg. Thanks for being with us. Here joining us now around the table as we get things started on this day after the first in the nation primary and another big win for Donald Trump is Bloomberg's Dan Flatley and Julie Fine with us from Texas. Julie, this is something else. The last poll we saw gave Donald Trump 60%. That was Suffolk University. He didn't poll 60, but the spread here is a problem. 54% to 43%. Nikki Haley has some very difficult decisions to make here. She says she's staying in, but 4 weeks of a bruising fight with not just Donald Trump, but MAGA Incorporated, Julie, could be too much for anyone, right?
It's going to be difficult, but Joe, and you and I have discussed this, she has to go to South Carolina. That is her home state. If she does not have a good showing in her home state, that's a real problem for her. You know, right now you've seen wealthy donors. They say they're sticking with her. She certainly has a large number. But the question is, if these numbers continue to go where they are, what is she going to do? Does she want to walk into Super Tuesday and just be hit with a whopper? I think South Carolina is going to tell us quite a bit.
Well, let's talk about South Carolina for a minute here, Dan. The last credible poll we had was from Emerson. This was back on the 5th of January. Trump, 54, Haley, 25. Now, that's before Ron DeSantis left the race. His votes could arguably go to Donald Trump, make that gap even wider. It's a very different place than New Hampshire and could be a very embarrassing defeat for Nikki Haley.
Yeah, Joe, I think, you know, it's going to be highly embarrassing for her, obviously, because that's her home state, as Julie was just saying. I think also it's going to tell us a lot about where this race is going from here. You know, it's been interesting to me to see, as Ron DeSantis has gotten out of the race, you know, the support for Haley sort of ticking up. Certainly several donors still backing her.
Yes.
But she doesn't really seem to be able to get over that threshold, 30-something%, 40-something%, to get to the point where she can really gather enough of a coalition around her to take on Trump. She's just not there yet.
Well, you know, one thing that Joe Biden has in common with Donald Trump today is that they have both decided the general election has begun. Certainly the language from Trump last night as he called Nikki Haley delusional following her upbeat speech to supporters, and Joe Biden making it clear in the White House statement, or the campaign statement, that this is going to be a rematch. We actually heard from Joe Biden today. Julie Fine, I want you to listen to this because he got an important endorsement, we could argue, as he paid a visit to the auto workers, the UAW. Remember, the first president to walk the picket line. He spoke after the endorsement from the UAW. Let's listen.
I kept my commitment to be the most pro-union president ever. I'm proud you have my back. Let me just say I'm honored to have your back and you have mine. That's the deal.
All right, Julie, so I guess it was worth the gamble to walk the picket line and put the T-shirt on and the whole thing. We were told that that was a controversial move. But we all know that the rank and file in the UAW voted for Trump. Does an endorsement like this change any minds?
Well, I'm not sure it changes any minds, but what the president can do is somewhat change the narrative. He can say, oh, you know, Trump, the former president has these big numbers, but look what I'm doing here with some of his supporters. I mean, I think what President Biden needs to do is spend a whole lot of time in a small number of states in events like that one in order to show that he still has the support that he felt in 2020, Joe.
Yeah. One of the most important issues, if not the most important issue in this campaign, certainly in the Republican primary, has been immigration. Dan, we've talked about this a lot. They're working on a deal in the Senate right now. It's unclear if this is going to see the light of day. But to see these polls show that immigration in states like Iowa and New Hampshire, a lot closer to Canada than they are Mexico, is far and beyond the most important issue, far beyond the economy, stupid. And it makes you think that the ground is shifting a bit under our feet here. And we're trying to gauge any potential success or opportunity for a deal on the border, knowing that this could be very toxic in the House. We talked about that yesterday, in fact, with a surrogate of Donald Trump, Florida Congresswoman Kat Cammack, in conversation with Bloomberg. Here she is.
What I can tell you as someone from the Republican ticket, someone who has been to the border 9 times, my colleagues and I will accept nothing less than a border security package. And what has been proposed by the Senate is really just a trade-off for billions more of Ukraine funding. It's pretty shameful when you have the sitting president of the United States who is willing to secure Ukraine's border, but not our own.
Well, we've heard that line certainly before from conservatives in the House, but Dan, there's still no text.
Right.
How do they know they don't want to vote for it?
There's no text, and there's a lot of disagreement among even the Senate GOP over what the right approach to this is. And certainly the border is an important issue, not just for the Republicans in the House and the Senate, and the Democrats for that matter, but for President Joe Biden. As Julie was saying, and as we have talked about, Biden needs to win a few states. Those are the ones that are really important: Michigan, Wisconsin. And the border is certainly going to be as an important an issue there as it is in Iowa and New Hampshire and some of these other places. So he needs to rally his coalition, his swing voters to his cause.
Yeah.
And the way to do that is through the border. And they need to come up with some sort of solution here. Whether they can or not at the end of the day, we'll see. But Ukraine funding obviously rides on this too. And that's hugely important, not just for the campaign, but arguably, some would say, for the the fate of the free world. Not to put too fine a point on it, but basically, if you can't get funding for Ukraine, you're going to have a very different geopolitical picture at the end of this.
What did the White House tell Republican leaders in that meeting with the Big Four? Mike Johnson, the other leaders went over to the cabinet room to sit down with Joe Biden. Jake Sullivan gave them a classified, we're told, detailed briefing on what would happen to Ukraine and Europe if the funding ran out. How scary was that presentation that Mike Johnson heard?
I'm sure it was incredibly sobering. You don't need to be in a classified setting to understand that without U.S. assistance, primarily, some from Europe, of course, but without U.S. assistance and in the billions of dollars, Ukraine is going to look very different in the next few years than it does even today with the border situation that's going on with Russia and the invasion and everything. But without U.S. funding, and you talk to folks who represent the European parliaments, they will tell you the U.S. needs to get involved here. So without that, it's going to be a very difficult situation.
So let's take a look at the calendar here, Julie. The beginning of March is going to be critical here with a potential government shutdown. This current continuing resolution we're under expires March 1st and 8th. In the middle of that, you've got a State of the Union address. You've got the beginning of Donald Trump's trial and potentially an opportunity here to solve the border crisis, because guess what? Everyone's coming to your state on Super Tuesday, and you better believe Donald Trump's going to be down at the border. Is that kind of a quiet deadline to get this done?
I mean, I think that for Democrats and Republicans, there are all kinds of issues that the border presents. For Democrats at this point, this is an issue for Democratic voters. I mean, let's look at Iowa and New Hampshire. They don't border the southern border, and the immigration is their top issue. So at this point, Democrats even know they have to do something about the border. So if they propose something and it gets through and Republicans say no, Republicans have that problem. However, Ukraine, again, like you said, is extremely important. And in that timeline, you also have Super Tuesday. So it's a huge couple of weeks for Congress. And the question is, who wants to say yes, who wants to say no, and who wants to take the blame, Joe?
Well, and as we consider the future security of Ukraine, there's an important story that, Dan, you have on the terminal here. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee advancing legislation to give the U.S. the authority to seize Russian sovereign assets. Is that a piece of legislation that would advance in the House with what we're hearing?
Yeah, I think it would advance both in the House and the Senate. That legislation today, sponsored by Jim Risch, a Republican, and Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat.
Yep.
It has a lot of bipartisan support. A lot of folks are looking at it as a pressure release valve. You know, there's potentially hundreds of billions of dollars there when you talk about Europe. That could alleviate some of the pressure on funding. It's not so much that the money will take the place of what Congress could pass, but it makes it easier to talk about this on the campaign trail, to say, look, we're going to step in, the U.S. taxpayers are going to step in and fund the defense of Ukraine, but we're also going to use some of Russia's own assets against it. Still a very controversial measure because it has to do with the dollar and the strength of the U.S. financial system at some point, too. So we'll see.
Well, we've got a lot of cross currents here because we have to remind ourselves that we still can't even figure out how to write a budget or fund the government. And our thanks to Bloomberg's Dan Flatley and Julie Fine getting into the details here. Great conversation this day after the primary. And coming up, we'll continue that talk with more reaction to former President Trump's win over Nikki Haley in New Hampshire with Pimco's head of U.S. public policy, Libby Cantrill's up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think that the risks are even greater today because our debt-GDP ratio is CBO estimates at about 100% right now. It's the highest in the history of the country, except for 1946 and 47, when we were coming back out of World War II. I think the risks are enormous, and some of them are materializing already, like higher interest rates and effect on inflation, in part, not in full. And others haven't materialized yet, but I think they're out there, and sooner or later will materialize if we don't correct our fiscal trajectory.
It's Balance of Power live from Washington. I'm Joe Matthew. Kayleigh Lines is making her way back from New Hampshire and will be with us tomorrow. That was former U.S. Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin on Wall Street Week with David Weston. When asked about the state of the U.S. financially, I'm joined now by Libby Cantrill, Managing Director at Pimco and Head of U.S. Public Policy on this day after the primary. Libby, I was looking back at your notes from just before the primary and after. And great to see you, by the way. You said going into this, if Trump wins New Hampshire, he will be the nominee. You then wrote today after the fact that Nikki Haley's performance was not strong enough to dethrone Trump. So is this over?
Yeah. Hi, Joe. Nice to be on with you. Yeah, effectively, for all intents and purposes, this is over. I think that there have been folks who have not wanted this to be a coronation of Donald Trump as a Republican nominee. But I think for all intents and purposes, that is what we are getting. Now, as Nikki Haley has indicated, she plans on staying in until South Carolina. We know that's February 24th. That's in about a month. So we do have about 4 weeks of this potential dynamic to continue. But I also, Joe, would not necessarily be surprised if she didn't pull out before then. So I think a lot of this will be predicated on what her donors have indicated to her privately. She has a few fundraisers up here in New York, so how successful those are. But I think for all intents and purposes, and I think this is what you're already seeing the messaging from, certainly from President Biden, but even from former President Trump, that this is effectively now segueing into a general election contest from a primary contest.
Well, it sure seems like Joe Biden and Donald Trump want that to be the case, and they're acting like it. But tell us more about the Wall Street angle here, because you're right. There's an important meeting on January 30th with some big-name donors. Think Druckenmiller, Langone, and others who are going to prop up this campaign to get Nikki Haley apparently through the next 4 weeks. She's already dropping $4 million on ads in South Carolina. If the money keeps coming in, Libby, does the candidate stay in the race?
I think she does. I mean, she, unlike Florida Governor DeSantis, she is not a current serving public official. And again, I think that this is obviously her home state. She was a popular governor. Now she is lagging President Trump by about 30 points, but we all know that polls can be fickle. It doesn't necessarily indicate who actually turns out to vote. Now, as you know, Joe, from our kind of policy nerd perspective, South Carolina not only has a different demographic, certainly from New Hampshire and then from Iowa, but also their primary is quite different. They do actually theoretically have an open primary, meaning if you're unaffiliated voters can vote in the Republican primary on February 24th. However, those folks need to register in order to be able to vote, and they need to register next week. So it's not as easy, it's not sort of as flexible as the New Hampshire primary. And certainly if you just look at the exit polls, the independents really did disproportionately break for Nikki Haley. They very much supported Nikki Haley. So the fact that that demographic in South Carolina is quite different from New Hampshire, that will likely be a headwind for her.
Yeah, it's like a different universe politically, certainly with the number of evangelicals who are probably planning to vote for Donald Trump. But we'll have more time to talk about South Carolina as we get closer. Libby Cantrill, I want to ask you about what's happening here in Washington, because the last time we spoke, we were questioning whether there would be a government shutdown. They've extended this with a short-term funding deal that gets us into March. I wonder if you're concerned about a shutdown actually taking place, or if a border deal could possibly emerge from this Congress and get the gears turning.
Yeah, I would say, we've been talking to our clients about a possible government shutdown now since September, and their eyes simply just glaze over. I think that's sort of the market's view as well, that, we've seen this movie now several times before. We know how that ends. Joe, of course, there is a possibility that we do see a shutdown. However, Speaker Johnson is navigating such a small House majority, actually one of the smallest in all of history. And as a result, he most likely will have to bring things to the floor, circumventing what's called the Rules Committee and using a tool called the suspension vote, which requires 2/3 of the House. And the only reason I bring that up, that means most likely he is going to have to bring up things that can get both the bulk of Republicans and Democratic support. And as a result, either we see another stopgap measure, or we see some of these appropriation bills, but they don't have any sort of policy riders. And I think the punchline here is that they're funded at the levels that were agreed to back in June as part of the debt ceiling deal. So all of this, noise, and I think it is just noise from a market's perspective, because everyone sort of learned to sort of shake it off and ignore it, has not necessarily resulted, I think, in what a lot of Republicans had wanted to see, which were lower funding levels from that debt ceiling deal. But alas, what is most likely is that we see the funding levels that were codified back in June just continue forward for this year.
Incredible to think a speaker lost his job in the middle of that.
Yeah, well, exactly.
It's the definition of dysfunction, I guess. But Libby, I've got to ask you, though, in the middle of all this chaos, there's this ray of light apparently called a tax deal. And I can't even imagine how this is going to come together, but it looks like it just might. In a deal it's a bipartisan deal that would extend the child tax credit in favor, or in exchange, rather, for more favorable business taxes. This has enough support. So could we be in a world in which we have no budget, but we somehow codify a tax deal?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. I would say, so, Speaker Johnson has indicated that the House may vote on it next week, again, going through circumventing that Rules Committee, putting it right on the House floor with the assumption that he's got 2/3 of the House. It likely could garner that. It passed out of the committee by 40-3. So for all of the talk about partisanship and polarization, we are seeing members of Congress work together. However, Joe, and this is a big however, even if it were to pass, it is not necessarily a fait accompli at all in the Senate. And actually, if you see Senator Mike Crapo, who is the ranking member of Senate Finance, he has definitely poured cold water, not buckets of cold water, but teaspoons of cold water on this. I think that some of that skepticism just increase. So I would say let's not count it out yet, but let's also not count it in either.
I feel the optimism. I'm sticking with it while I can. Pimco's Libby Cantrill, thank you so much for the insights. As always, Libby, for being with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, former House Speaker, the aforementioned Kevin McCarthy, in conversation with Bloomberg. That's next on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Former Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy says he expects Nikki Haley to end her presidential campaign and end it soon. He spoke earlier today here on Bloomberg.
She's losing South Carolina. At the end of the day, I do not think Nikki Haley wants to lose her home state that badly. I think she'll probably pull out. I think it's difficult for her to win the majority. But the one advice I'd give to President Trump, it's about addition, not subtraction. His speech in Iowa was much different than his speech in New Hampshire last night. And what I would do if I was him, I would draw Biden into the campaign. Because every time Biden goes out, he shows his weakness. Biden cannot fix his biggest problem, his age. Immigration has now overtaken the economy. And the problem here is for Biden is he created it. There was no new bill that passed that created this rush of people across our border. It is just his administration policies. So he doesn't need the House and Senate to work out an agreement. He can do this administratively. So he's in a really bad position. He won last time by hiding. He cannot hide. So if I was Trump, I would start pulling Biden out. I would make the issue. Remember, a re-election is a report card. Your first election is aspirational. What are you going to do? Now there's going to be a report card on what you did, and no president has walked into a re-election in modern history lower than this, even Jimmy Carter.
Well, the former president has got to do something about attracting independents.
Yes.
Any evidence that he can do that based on what you've seen in Iowa and New Hampshire?
You can, because the challenge is looking back home. You sit here and you talk about data, what's happening in Wall Street. Voters are going to be voting on the passion of what's happening on Main Street. And if you look at what those interest rates are for a small business to get a loan at 12%, nothing's happening. So that's not going to change that drastically between now and November, and they feel it. They feel inflation when they go there. They know what the price of gasoline is. They see the border. Think of this. There's not one Republican in Congress elected from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has a state of emergency based upon the southern border. You're here in New York. What does the mayor and governor say? Their number one issue is immigration. What is Illinois, a very big blue state governor? He's crying, don't send any more buses.
So on immigration,
stuff.
with Trump basically now being the de facto nominee, is that going to paint the fact that maybe this deal can't get done? Because why would Republicans in the House give Biden a win ahead of November?
Well, if you're elected, you want to solve a problem. The hang-up isn't with Republicans. The hang-up is with the president. Will he change his administrative policies that he put in place, not by any vote? And he is holding back doing that. In the House, we have a very small...
I'm talking about the border Ukraine aid package, the supplemental that the Senate is working on.
Yeah. Let's talk border. Ukraine and supplemental is different. Do I think it gets done? I think it's very difficult. Every day that progresses, less likely. But remember, in the House, you passed a bill. When we were Speaker, we had a 4-seat majority. Well, we passed the strongest immigration bill, border security, that we've ever done. We haven't been able to do it when we had a 30-seat majority. And what you've watched, that sat over in the Senate, they have not acted. That's a Senate majority. The president hasn't taken any administrative action. You've got now the president even saying the border is not secure, something he hasn't said in a long time. He's got his own secretary saying something different.
The view of former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. We'll have much more ahead on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
She's losing South Carolina. At the end of the day, I do not think Nikki Haley wants to lose her home state that badly. I think she'll probably pull out. I think it's difficult for her to win the majority.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Considering what we heard there from former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, the Republican from California, speaking earlier today on Bloomberg Surveillance. Joining us now with her view this day after New Hampshire is Amy Walter, Cook Political Report Editor-in-Chief. It's great to see you, Amy. I was looking for you in New Hampshire. I didn't see you or, frankly, just about anyone else while I was there. There was a sense of inevitability in the air. People were upset. There were no debates. They thought this thing was over already. When we look at the numbers in South Carolina, to Kevin McCarthy's point, Nikki Haley's down 30 points. We've got 4 weeks to go, and it seems like the money's still flowing. Do you buy into this talk that she's about to leave the race, or is she going to go through at least her home state here against Donald Trump?
Right. I mean, that is the decision that only a candidate can make. Sorry. That, yes, money is going to be a factor there, especially when you realize that this is a month-long slog. This isn't just, can I sprint my way for a week and get into the primary and see where we go from there. So It is a very, very heavy lift. And look, when you put the exit polls or entrance polls together from Iowa and South Carolina, the pattern is pretty clear. Where Nikki Haley does best is with independent voters. And a state like New Hampshire, I think almost half the electorate was independent. But she's losing Republican voters by in New Hampshire, something like 50 points. You can't win the Republican nomination if you're losing Republicans by that margin. And even in her home state, as you pointed out, the numbers don't look very good. One thing that has been notable for these primaries is the fact that the polling thus far has been pretty spot on. It
how about that?
Suggested, the polling from New Hampshire, for example, suggested that Trump was going to win by 10 to 14 points. Looks like now it's 11 points that he will have won New Hampshire. So I don't think we should look at that 30-point number and say, oh, well, the polls have been, so far off in this primary thus far, we can't take them seriously. I think this is sort of the reality of where we are.
You talk about the personal decision that a candidate has to make. Just imagine what the next 4 weeks will be like for Nikki Haley if she decides to stay in this race, having been called delusional last night from the former president, and a lot worse when he trains the MAGA fire on her. It's going to be something. Listen, just an example here from last night in New Hampshire, the former president drawing attention to the fact that Senator Tim Scott, who was on stage with him, chose not to endorse Nikki Haley. Let's give it a listen.
Did you ever think that she actually appointed you, Tim? And think of it, appointed, and you're the senator of his state, and she endorsed me. You must really hate her.
That's quite an ad lib. Just imagine the way he could reshape her own image, control her narrative for the next 4 weeks. This is a lot for any candidate to endure.
A very good point. And in your own backyard. This isn't a state where she can just sort of write that off and go back to life as usual. This is where she resides and where her political career began. It's not just Donald Trump who's putting the pressure on her personally. He's putting pressure on everyone else in the state. You have the entire congressional delegation now that is behind Donald Trump. You saw what is happening with Senator Tim Scott. And you're right, the amount of firepower that the Trump campaign can put on television, as well as what he can do in those sorts of settings, rallies, et cetera, it will be intensive. And of course, I think putting pressure on donors as well, to Haley, who he will say, there are public lists of donors to other candidates. Just saying.
Yeah, how about that? Enter Joe Biden, who thinks the general started this morning. He's got a big endorsement today, or presumably from the UAW, and I wonder your thoughts on the potential impact of the United Auto Workers following up with him as he was the first president to march on a picket line. Will that make a difference in a place like Michigan, where UAW rank and file pulled the lever for Trump?
This is what Biden has really been counting on. And actually, it was the premier part of his campaign strategy in 2020, was that he could win over some of those voters who had abandoned Democrats between 2012 and 2016. And when you look at a state like Pennsylvania, for example, where Biden really improved on Hillary Clinton's showing, were in places like Scranton and Wilkes-Barre and Erie, Pennsylvania, right? Those smaller metro areas, very working class. And the message that the campaign wants to send isn't simply, look, we have rank and file or workers on our side, but that this is an administration that is focused on the economy that works for people who are working people.
What happens to Dean Phillips? We talked to folks who were driving the write-in campaign for the president of the United States in New Hampshire. Dean Phillips almost pulled 20, which I think was his goal. He mentioned that number a couple of times when we talked to him. Is this all done now? What happens to Dean Phillips?
Well, Dean Phillips is on the ballot officially in South Carolina, and Democrats have their primary on Saturday, February 3rd. So we'll see where he pulls in there. I don't think he's spent any money in South Carolina yet. Obviously, as you noted, he parked himself in New Hampshire and spent millions of dollars in New Hampshire. Was on the ballot in New Hampshire, unlike President Biden, and still only got 20%. And the ballots, by the way, haven't been finished. They haven't finished tabulating all the write-ins. The one other thing is that if you want to compare him to big, whether we wanted to call them upsets or at least where a candidate surprised and really shocked the incumbent president, the high watermark, of course, is Eugene McCarthy in 1968 getting 42% of the vote to LBJ, who was also a write-in, or go to Pat Buchanan in 1992, who got 38% of the vote against President George H.W. Bush. I don't find 19.5% to be particularly impressive against those metrics.
Sounds like we might be done here on both sides of things, but we're going to stay in touch with Amy Walter.
I know. It's just, again, these are, you're right. It's only two states, two very small states that have weighed in. But the reality of the kind of the electorate, what the electorate is saying in both of those states is reflective of what we're seeing in states around the country and what we've been seeing nationally.
Well, we're going to continue doing both here. We're going to talk about this race while it is still won. We're going to acknowledge voters' opportunity to weigh in on this. We're also going to acknowledge reality with voices like Amy Walter. It's great to see you again, Amy. Cook Political Report Editor-in-Chief. Thanks for the conversation the day after New Hampshire. Coming up, Nikki Haley is still hanging on, obviously, here, even after that tough showing in New Hampshire. We're going to have more on that, break it down, and look ahead with our political panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
She doesn't win this. This is not your typical victory speech, but let's not have somebody take a victory when she had a very bad night. She had a very bad night.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for coming along. Just hours after that speech was delivered by former President Donald Trump in his victory speech, not a typical one, as he mentioned, after winning the New Hampshire Republican primary. With us now, our political panel, Lincoln Mitchell, a Columbia University School of International Public Affairs lecturer and Democratic analyst, is with us from New York. Lisa Camusa-Miller, former RNC Communications Director, the host of the Friday Reporter podcast, with me here in the nation's capital. Great to see you both. Deeply curious to hear your thoughts, as so many in the Republican Party, your Republican Party, Lisa, want to call this to a close. Isn't that why Tim Scott ran up to New Hampshire before anyone even got to South Carolina? There seems to be not only a sense of inevitability, but exhaustion. Let's just start this general election. Is that how you see it?
Well, yes, I think that's probably how a lot of folks do see it. I think the word exhaustion is probably also quite apt.
Only two contests in.
But this is going to be exactly as we've heard and as we've predicted. It's going to be a very negative race, a very expensive race, because everything we've seen from what Amy Walter said earlier, what we're hearing in the polls, what we're hearing from the electorate is that no one is really excited about either one of these candidates. Right. And that alone means that we're going to go to a very negative and very divisive rhetoric. And so we may as well get into it because we've got 10 months to go. But it is also unfortunate, I think, because in spite of the fact that the polls say that that the race has already been decided between the two candidates. I'm sure the people in my hometown in New Jersey and everywhere else would have liked to have a little bit more of a say before we got going.
Yeah, well, I don't know if that strikes you the same way, Lincoln. Those of us who cover this for a living and are involved in the public process value what it means to get out of your house and vote, whether you're caucusing in Iowa or pulling a lever or filling out a ballot in New Hampshire. We also have to acknowledge where we are. Does Nikki Haley have any path after what happened last night?
Nikki Haley had no path 3 months ago. This primary, this nomination has always been Donald Trump. So the notion that this was competitive was aspirational. And many of us wanted it to be competitive, but it never was going to be competitive. Haley did respectably in New Hampshire. She lost by 12 points, but she has nowhere to go. Yeah. And she has a choice. She can find a way to get out on her terms or be humiliated in her home state. My suggestion is she will opt towards the former at some point. It doesn't have to be, she has a month. She can do it in a week. She can do it in 2 weeks. But I don't see the logic of her staying in. It would be a very quixotic campaign if she continues. Trump has now wrapped up his third consecutive presidential nomination for the Republican Party. Nixon was nominated 3 times, but not consecutively. Only Roosevelt has done 3 or more. And this is his party, and it's been his party for several years now.
The reaction from the Republican National Committee, which of course you once represented as its spokesman, is striking. Ronna McDaniel urging Nikki Haley to get out of the race, saying on Fox that it is now past time for the Republican Party to unite around President Trump. Wasn't that sort of sacred ground in the old days as you ran the RNC? You let this shake out first?
Yeah.
Let people vote?
Absolutely, Joe. And the other thing, too, is that she's about to find herself in a place where she could be in violation of some of the rules of the party itself by doing that. And so, but look, this is a different party than the party that I worked for. I mean, I worked for a party that did stay out of the primary, and it was not the time for the spokesperson and the chair to speak up until we had a nominee. But this is a very different time, and so for that reason, I think that it's indicative of what we saw when we were hearing from the chairwoman last night, is that it is more than likely that Nikki Haley will step out at some point soon. And
before South Carolina.
Yes, I do think so. I mean, I think Lincoln's point is very good. If I'm her, I'm the former very popular governor of South Carolina, I certainly would not want this to be the way that I would go out.
Or the reason you can't run in 28.
Correct.
If this gets to be really embarrassing. Lincoln, the president just tweeted, I'm sure he's listening and watching us right now, and he's tweeting about Donald Trump. He says, my predecessor says he wants to see the stock market crash. You know why? He doesn't want to be the next Herbert Hoover, but he already is, writes Joe Biden. He's the only other president who lost jobs during his term. You see a tweet like that, and it sure makes you feel like the general is on, Lincoln.
It makes me feel like the general is on. It also makes me think that Joe Biden needs some help with his social media game.
How come?
Because I'm a professor of political science. I know who Herbert Hoover is. I don't think too many Americans under 60 know who Herbert Hoover is. And secondly, the syntax is kind of mangled there. A better tweet might be, the stock market is an all-time high. Keep me in the White House, right? Cut to the chase. So the general election is definitely on. This is the rematch they both want. Trump wants another go at Biden, and Biden believes he's the guy that can beat Trump. But that makes them unusual because the rest of the 330 million Americans, as far as I can see, desperately don't want this rematch, and that may be exactly why we're getting it.
Well, boy, isn't that the truth? And it makes you wonder about a third party. This no labels idea just got a lot bigger, didn't it? If we're racing to Super Tuesday, they said, we'll make up our mind if it's Biden versus Trump. Could come a lot sooner than that.
Yes, but I think that could serve up a candidate that would make everyone very unhappy because as much as there might be a lane for a third party at some point and people are looking for another option other than these two, it is so late and there is already so much skin in the game that it only will offer us a candidate that will take away from either Joe Biden or Donald Trump and put the person that we don't want to see back in the White House.
We keep talking about no labels, Lincoln. I've only got 30 seconds here. Should we just be talking out loud about RFK Jr., considering the support and the money he's managed to gather?
RFK Jr. is intriguing because he could conceivably draw from both sides. Cornel West is in here to deliver Michigan to Donald Trump. And no labels probably helps Trump, but we're not sure. The bottom line, however, is that no labels, Cornel West and Robert Kennedy Jr. will combine for precisely 0 electoral votes. And, you know, we could debate it, but I would be surprised if combined they broke 6 or 7% of the electorate. The Americans half are going to be scared of Biden, half are going to be scared of Trump, and they're going to go home to their political parties in November.
And another split finish. Coming up, we're going to stick with our great panel here and turn our focus to Capitol Hill, whether senators can finally complete a deal on the border and Ukraine, and whether it will matter with what's happening in the House. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
One thing we do know about this bill, there will be nothing in there that will directly impact anything, whether it's Ukraine aid or anything else, if the border's not secured.
He's not a fan. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Kaylee Lyons will be back with us tomorrow. Senator Rick Scott there of Florida earlier, joining us now as our political panel. Lincoln Mitchell, Columbia University School of International Public Affairs lecturer, alongside Lisa Camusa Miller, former RNC communications director and the host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Give us a reality check, Lincoln, on this debate right now in the Senate. Even if Jim Lankford and the other negotiators somehow defy gravity and make this happen, actually craft a generational deal on the border, what makes us think that goes anywhere in the House?
Very likely it doesn't go anywhere in the House, and because of what some refer to as the Denny Hastert rule, the idea being that Republicans would have to have a majority of the party before Mike Johnson would bring this forth, means it probably goes nowhere. There is the potential for a two-party coalition in the House, but you probably would only get a handful of Republicans. So my sense is that, unfortunately, this is not going anywhere. And the reason I say unfortunately is, you know, we talk a lot about politics here, but it is the role of Congress and the White House to govern. And part of governance is compromise and deal-making and negotiating, and this would be a failure to be able to do that.
Referencing your former speaker, I wonder your thoughts here, because this would be a big deal if they hammer out a compromise on the border. And it's the speaker now who could be the problem, because they say he's on the phone with Donald Trump on the regular. We know about opposition in the Freedom Caucus. What's the role Donald Trump plays in this, though? He's not going to let Joe Biden get a win if he can help it, is he?
No, absolutely not. That's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, if anything, delivering a win on the border right now is a win for the Democrats. And so I'm hopeful that something will happen, and because this is a crisis that's happening, it's not only a Republican crisis, it's a bipartisan crisis. And let me be the first guy to say it out loud today, but bipartisan is not a bad word. You know, so there should be some action, and there should be something done. Nothing will be enough, right? It is a crisis that will continue to go on and needs to be solved. But the reason why the speaker, if that is true, and if he is on the phone with the nominee or the presumptive nominee, then I suspect that that's what they're talking about, is not delivering that, so that there is more to talk about.
Well, that's a pretty sad state of affairs, Lincoln. How about we project even further in a world in which there is no border deal for reasons we just mentioned? That means no money for Ukraine, no money for Israel, no money for Taiwan. Can't figure out a budget. Maybe there's a CR that takes us through the rest of the fiscal year with the sequester, that across-the-board budget cut that's already built in for April. That's what Washington has in store for us, isn't it?
And that makes for a very tough re-election fight for Joe Biden. One of Donald Trump's messages, to the extent he can form a coherent message, and that's not a given, is that Joe Biden is an agent of chaos, which is, of course, ironic, because there's no greater agent of chaos than Donald Trump. But he wants to be able to look at the world and say, this war in Ukraine, which I never supported, is just stuck at a deadlock and it's ongoing. And Biden isn't able to support our ally Israel, and the border's a mess. And to change that, you need to bring me in. I'm strong. I'll make America great again. And to some segment of the American electorate, that will appeal. If this deal gets cut, as Lisa has pointed out, it's a big win on a lot of different fronts for Joe Biden.
Sure it is.
And Biden had a lot of wins in his first 2 years as president on the legislative front, and that helped stop the red wave. And another one here could keep him back in the White House for another 4 years.
Pretty remarkable. We're really bringing some uplifting messaging here the day after New Hampshire. Thank you for helping us smile through it. Lincoln Mitchell and Lisa Camuso Miller, a great panel and conversation as we consider the way forward here coming off the first in the nation primary. Thank you for being with us on Bloomberg Radio, on YouTube, and on Bloomberg TV. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter to learn a lot more on the terminal and online. Thank you for being with us on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow with Kaylee Lyons in Washington. This is Bloomberg.